What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 288 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today, I want to talk to you about JLA 1 Million. This is not, strictly speaking, part of Grant Morrison's Justice League run. This was more of a huge DC Comics summer crossover event where the Justice League was very integral in the whole thing. This builds off of a lot of stuff that Morrison had already set up in earlier volumes of his Justice League run, and it even sets up some stuff that will show up in later volumes. For example, the Ultramarine Corps from General Eiling. I don't remember which volume that was, but they show up in like a one-panel cameo in this book. Our Man, who showed up at least once in this run in the Rock of Ages storyline, he is a much bigger part here than he was there. So we get stuff that kind of ties together all of his Justice League run here, but this also spans other parts of the DC Universe that were not being done by Grant Morrison at this time. But this particular volume only collects the stuff that is, I don't want to say necessary, but the stuff that is actually part of the story that Grant Morrison is telling here. There are 4 issues of the DC 1 Million crossover, and then there's a couple of other side stories that are collected here that are pretty notable in this story. One of them is a Starman issue. I think there's a Green Lantern issue, maybe. I don't remember. One of them, I believe, is a Superman issue that ties in with it all. So there's other stuff that's not collected here, like the Teen Titans 1 Million tie-in, or the Martian Manhunter 1 Million tie-in, which, by the way, that was collected in one of the John Ostrander Martian Manhunter books, which I reviewed earlier this year, and I highly recommend those. So just because it's not collected in this book doesn't mean that it wasn't worthwhile. It just means that it didn't strictly tie in with the story that Grant Morrison is doing here. And the story is, I don't want to say it's a very simple story, but it's not as complicated as it might seem upon reading this for the first time. So basically, the Justice League from the 853rd century, they come to the past and they want to hold a ceremonial combat game involving the original Justice League. And they take them to the future, and in theory, they're only supposed to be gone for like a split second, and then they will come back, and time will have moved much longer for them in the future than it will have in the present day. So they go to the future thinking like this is going to be a piece of cake, and then if something happens in the past while the Justice League of this time is in the future, then the Justice League of the 853rd century, they will be here in the past, ready to protect the planet. Unfortunately, things do not go the way that they thought they would. We have a two-pronged attack, if you will, by Vandal Savage, who is, I guess, the world's oldest human being, and Solaris, who is this evil computer son. And basically, Vandal Savage in the present day, he is buying some Rocket Red armor. Rocket Red was the Russian Iron Man, if you will, from the Justice League International comics in the 80s. He buys some of that armor to turn those into basically human bombs, if you will. He puts some of the Titans in these Rocket Red armor pieces, and he's going to start blowing up cities on the planet. And then meanwhile, the Vandal Savage in the future is teaming up with Solaris, and they want to destroy the Superman dynasty once and for all. Because we find out in this book that each of the members of the Justice League, or most of them anyway, they have very long-running dynasties extending all the way up into the 853rd century. For example, the Superman here is very distantly related to Superman. At one point, one of Superman's descendants married a imp from the 5th dimension, so he got a little bit of the Mixia's Spitlick powers thrown into his bloodline. So you've got all kinds of different weird time travel stuff going on here. I like that sort of thing. I have talked to people before who really, really loathe time travel stories. If you are one of those people, you are not going to like this book. It's got a little bit of that grandfather paradox stuff going on here, sort of, but then a lot of the stuff here that seems cyclical, seems like it's all destined to happen, kind of gets ignored in later volumes. For example, I'm going to talk about something that might be a little bit of a spoiler for this book, but it's really not. Vandal Savage in the 853rd century, he has an eye patch, and then we see the Vandal Savage of the 20th century at one point lose his eye. We get to see that happen in this story, and then you would think, okay, so I guess he is incapable of growing his eye back since 850-something centuries later he still has an eye patch. But then later on, around the time of 1 year later, I think, there was a Justice Society comic where Vandal Savage Savage did not have an eye patch. He was back to normal, had all of his pieces that he had missed at one point. So this book, I think, once again shows that sometimes Grant Morrison will introduce an idea, even if it's a small idea, like Vandal Savage losing an eye, and then later creators and comics will just ignore whatever Grant Morrison came up with. Another good example is Solaris, who is introduced here. Solaris would have been a fantastic Superman villain. Superman gets his powers from the sun. We have an evil cybernetic sun called Solaris. That would have been a really great villain to occasionally throw into a Superman comic. As near as I can tell, the only person who has ever used Solaris since this story is Grant Morrison in his All-Star Superman run. Speaking of his All-Star Superman run, at one point, one of the Superman from the 853rd century, he mentions the, I don't remember if it was called the League of Supermen or the Legion of Supermen, but that group of Supermen that we got to see in All-Star Superman, spoilers, in the issue where Pa Kent dies, we get to see them mentioned here. We don't actually see them in action, but it's kind of cool that Morrison is using some of his ideas that were seemingly throwaway ideas here in later stories that seemingly aren't even connected to the main DC universe, like All-Star Superman, where he's taking characters like Solaris and the Legion of Supermen or the League of Supermen. I don't remember what they were called. But anyway, I like this story quite a bit. It is a little confusing on your first read. You got to go back and read it through a second time, and I think a lot of the stuff that seems a little confusing at first makes a lot more sense the second time. There's some stuff that doesn't really get cleared up. For example, the Batman of the 853rd century, he tricks the Batman of the present day into going into the future because obviously our Batman would not participate in something so gaudy, but our Batman of the future, he kind of tricks him into going, and then he says he has his reasons. We never really find out why. That's something that maybe got explained in one of the tie-in comics that's not collected here. I don't know. I haven't read the omnibus that collects all that other stuff. I'm kind of tempted to, but on the other hand, this is the meat of the story. This is really all that you need for the main story. Everything else is just icing on the cake, if you will. I just created an incredibly gross metaphor of meat and icing that just sounds disgusting. Anyway, I do think that you guys should check this out. If anything, if you are reading Grant Morrison's Justice League run, and then for some reason you've skipped this because maybe you're seeing it as more of a DC Comics crossover and not a Justice League story, you definitely need to read this. It picks up on some of the stuff that he developed earlier in his run, and then it sets up sort of some of the stuff that he'll be dealing with later. So you definitely need to work on reading this. And anyway, I like this quite a bit. I hope that you guys will enjoy it, and I hope that you guys like this video. If you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back tomorrow with a different video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.